My name is Jack Morrison. I'm 52 years old, born and raised in the Midwest where people still believe a man's word should mean something. And this is the part of my story where everything quietly changed, even though on the outside it looked like I was falling apart. Because when people started whispering that I was losing my mind, I didn't argue with them, I didn't defend myself, I didn't try to prove how sharp I still was. I just let it happen. I'd let them believe the wrinkles on my face meant weakness, that the extra second I took before answering a question meant confusion, that the way I sometimes stared out the window meant I drifted off instead of thinking 10 steps ahead. And the truth is I had never been more alert in my life, because something happens when you cross 50 in America. People stop listening to what you say and start watching you closely for mistakes. They wait for you to slip. They expect you to repeat yourself, to forget names, to misplace facts. And the moment they decide you're on the decline, they relax, they stop guarding their words, they stop covering their tracks, they start showing you exactly who they are. And that's when the real power shifts, because a man who is underestimated sees things others miss. And while they were busy nodding at me with polite smiles and talking slower like I was fragile glass, I was noticing everything: the way conversations stopped when I walked into a room, the way emails suddenly excluded me, the way meetings were scheduled just a little earlier or a little later than usual so I wouldn't be there, the way people who once asked for my approval now only informed me after decisions were made. And I could feel the respect draining out of the room day by day. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, like air leaking from a tire. And instead of panicking, instead of confronting anyone, I leaned back and watched, because I'd lived long enough to know that panic is what gets you exposed, and patience is what lets the truth rise on its own. See, I wasn't always this calm. When I was younger, I reacted fast, spoke loud, pushed hard. But age teaches you something valuable if you let it. It teaches you that silence makes people uncomfortable, and uncomfortable people talk. And they talk even more when they think the man listening doesn't fully understand anymore. And that's exactly what they thought about me, that I was slipping, that my best days were behind me, that I was a relic, hanging on too long. And they said it in different ways, sometimes with fake concern, sometimes with forced jokes, sometimes with long pauses where they waited for me to forget what I was about to say. And every time it happened, I smiled and nodded and played the role they handed me, because I could see the confidence growing in their eyes, the way they stood taller, the way they spoke freer, the way they started making mistakes right in front of me. And the funny thing is, nobody suspects the old guy in the room of planning anything. They think planning belongs to the young, the hungry, the aggressive, not to a man with gray at his temples and a slower walk. And that's exactly why I became invisible. And being invisible is the most dangerous position of all, because while they thought I was losing track, I was tracking everything: dates, tone changes, small shifts in loyalty, who laughed too hard at whose jokes, who avoided eye contact, who suddenly treated me like a guest in a house I built with my own hands. And I go home at night, sit at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold, and replay every interaction in my head, not with anger but with clarity, because anger clouds judgment but clarity sharpens it. And the more they underestimated me, the clearer everything became. I realized they weren't just doubting me, they were counting on my doubt. They needed me unsure of myself, hesitant, quiet, because a confident older man is a problem, but a confused one is an opportunity. And once I understood that, I stopped feeling insulted and started feeling prepared, because this wasn't about pride anymore. This was about survival, about legacy, about not letting decades of work end with people whispering that Jack Morrison lost his edge. And I knew something else too, something that only comes from living long enough to be betrayed before. People don't turn on you overnight. They rehearse it, they test it, they look for signs that it's safe. And when they saw me slow down, when they saw me let things slide, when they saw me not react, they took it as permission to speak freely, permission to bend rules, permission to move pieces without telling me. And every time they did, they unknowingly added another brick to the foundation I was quietly laying. Because I wasn't just watching actions, I was watching patterns: who benefited, who aligned with who suddenly had more confidence than experience justified, and who acted like they already knew the ending of a story I hadn't finished telling yet. And I'll tell you this: there is nothing more sobering than realizing the people who once depended on you are now waiting for you to fall. It hurts in a way that's hard to describe, not like anger, not like sadness, but like a deep disappointment that settles in your chest and makes you see the world differently. And that disappointment is dangerous too, because it can either break you or steady you. And I chose to let it steady me, to let it strip away any remaining illusions I had about loyalty or gratitude. Because at 52, illusions are heavier than truth. And I was done carrying weight I didn't need. So when they laughed behind my back and called me finished, when they exchanged looks that said the old man doesn't know what's coming, I smiled to myself, because they were right about one thing: something was coming. They just had no idea it was coming from the man they stopped fearing. And while they mistook my calm for confusion and my silence for surrender, I was already planning every single step, not in a rush, not with drama, but with the kind of patience that only comes when you've got nothing left to prove and everything left to protect. And that's where this story truly begins, in the quiet moment when an underestimated man decides he's done explaining himself and starts preparing instead. Because once people think you're losing your mind, they never see the plan forming right in front of them until it's far too late. I didn't inherit a business, I didn't get a loan from a family friend, and I sure as hell didn't have anyone waiting to catch me if I failed, because everything I built came from my own two hands and a stubborn refusal to quit. And when I say that, I don't mean it in a motivational poster kind of way. I mean it in the way where your back aches before you're 30 and your fingers stay stiff even in summer, because Morrison Field Services started with me alone in a beat-up pickup truck, a borrowed toolbox, and a notebook full of phone numbers I'd collected while working other people's jobs, showing up early, staying late, proving myself over and over until someone finally said, "Yeah, give Jack a shot," and that first year was nothing but stress and hope fighting each other every single day. Because some weeks I barely covered fuel costs, some months I wondered if I was lying to myself about this dream. But I kept going, because I believed that if you worked harder than the next guy and treated people fair, eventually it would add up, and slowly, painfully it did, one contract at a time, one client referral at a time, until I hired my first employee, then my second. Then suddenly I wasn't just working in the business, I was running it, and that transition nearly broke me because responsibility hits different when other people's paychecks depend on you, and I carry that weight seriously. I learned contracts at night, accounting on weekends, management through mistakes I paid for personally, and
There were years where the business grew faster than my confidence, but I kept pushing forward because quitting never felt like an option. And during all of that, life kept happening around me. Birthdays passed without me there. Anniversaries turned into quick dinners after midnight, school plays were recorded instead of watched, and every time I missed something, I told myself the same thing, that I was building something solid, something that would stand long after I slowed down, something my family could be proud of even if they were frustrated with me along the way. And I believed that lie just enough to keep going. Even when my marriage started cracking under the pressure. Even when my kids stopped asking if I'd be home on time because they already knew the answer. Because when you're building something from nothing, you convince yourself the sacrifice will make sense later, that the payoff will heal the distance, and while that part of my life didn't turn out the way I hoped, the company did grow. It grew into a regional operation with steady contracts, recognizable clients, and a reputation for reliability. And that reputation mattered to me more than profit because my name was on the trucks, on the paperwork, on the building, and I guarded it like a promise. And as the company grew, so did the people inside it, especially Eric, who came in young, eager, rough around the edges but smart. And I saw something in him that reminded me of myself, that hunger mixed with ambition, that need to prove he belonged in rooms where people didn't expect him. And I took him under my wing, not formally, not with speeches, just by showing him how things really worked, letting him sit in on meetings, explaining why some deals were worth walking away from even if the money looked good. Teaching him that pressure doesn't go away when you climb higher, it just changes shape. And I trusted him more than I should have, because trust is easier when you see yourself in someone else. And I didn't just teach him the technical stuff. I taught him the unwritten rules, who to listen to, who to be careful with, how to read a room before speaking, how to keep your word even when it costs you. And for years it felt right, like mentorship done the right way, like I was passing something meaningful forward. And when I promoted him, defended him in front of the board, gave him responsibilities others wanted, I did it without hesitation, because in my mind, I wasn't just building a company. I was building continuity. A future where Morrison Field Services didn't crumble the moment I stepped back. And I told myself that trusting the people I brought up was part of leadership, that treating them like blood created loyalty. And for a long time it seemed true, because Eric worked hard, delivered results, spoke confidently, and earned respect. And I felt proud watching him grow into the role. Proud enough that I ignored small warning signs, small changes in tone, small shifts in attitude. Because when you've poured decades into something, you want to believe the foundation is solid. You want to believe the people standing beside you are standing with you, not waiting for you to move aside. And I look back now and realize how dangerous that belief was. Because legacy isn't just about what you build. It's about who you trust to carry it forward. And I trusted too deeply, too personally, because I didn't separate the company from the relationships inside it. And that was my first real mistake, not hiring the wrong people, but assuming shared history meant shared values. Assuming gratitude lasts forever. Assuming loyalty ages the same way effort does. And it doesn't, because effort builds something, but loyalty needs constant honesty. And I was too busy working to notice how the ground beneath me was slowly shifting. How the business I built with my own hands was becoming something I was no longer fully in control of, not because I was incapable, but because I believed too much in the idea that what I built would protect me in return. And that belief, more than any financial risk or market downturn, set the stage for everything that came next. The change didn't hit me all at once, it crept in quietly, almost politely, the kind of shift you can ignore if you're busy or tired or too trusting. Because one day I was still the man leading the meetings and the next day I was being invited to them like a guest. And at first I told myself it was nothing, just efficiency, just delegation, just a natural evolution of a growing company. But then meetings I used to open and close started happening without me entirely. Decisions were already finalized by the time I sat down, and people spoke in summaries instead of discussions, like the conversation had already passed and I was just being brought up to speed. And the tone changed too, not openly disrespectful, just subtly altered, slower, careful, with extra explanations layered on top of things I'd built from the ground up. And I'd sit there listening to someone half my age explain processes I invented, nodding like it was all new to me, while inside I felt something tightening. Not anger, but awareness, because that's when I realized they weren't including me less because I knew less. They were including me less because they wanted me to know less. And once that thought settles in your mind, everything else starts lining up. The whispers when I walked into a room, conversations cutting off mid-sentence, laughter dropping into awkward silence, people suddenly busy with their phones when they used to look me in the eye, and I could feel the shift in how they looked at me, like I'd crossed an invisible line from leader to liability, and they thought age had dulled me, that years had slowed my thinking. But what age really did was give me the patience to observe without reacting, to let patterns form instead of confronting single moments. And that patience opened my eyes to details I might have missed when I was younger and quicker to speak, because I started noticing the numbers, not in a dramatic way, just small inconsistencies, rounding that didn't make sense, expenses that seemed too neat, vendors disappearing from reports without explanation, long-term partners replaced by unfamiliar names. And when I asked about it, the responses were always soft and dismissive, telling me not to worry, telling me everything was under control, telling me stress wasn't good for someone my age. And that line right there told me everything I needed to know, because it wasn't concern, it was deflection, wrapped in politeness, and every time they said it, I understood a little more clearly that they weren't worried about my health at all. They were worried about my attention, worried that if I focused too long on any one thread, the whole fabric would start to unravel. And I tested that theory quietly, by asking the same question twice in different meetings, watching who answered confidently the first time and who avoided it the second, by pretending to forget a detail I knew by heart just to see who rushed in to fill the gap, by staying silent, longer than comfortable, and letting people talk themselves into revealing things they assumed I wouldn't catch. And it worked better than I expected, because people get careless when they think they're smarter than you, and the more they underestimated me, the more relaxed they became. And that relaxation showed up in the numbers, in the emails copied to the wrong threads, in the side conversations held too close to open doors. And I'd drive home at night replaying it all, not with rage but with a growing sense of clarity, because it's one thing to feel pushed aside, but it's another thing entirely to realize it's happening by design. And that realization is sobering, because it forces you to ask yourself hard questions about trust, about loyalty, about how easily respect can turn into whispers once people believe you're no longer essential. And I felt the weight of that every day. The loneliness of sitting in a room full of people who used to listen and now only tolerated, the quiet dismissal wrapped in professional smiles. And yet, instead of breaking me, it sharpened me, because I knew then that speaking louder wouldn't fix it, demanding respect wouldn't restore it, and defending my past contributions wouldn't change their plans. Because once people start seeing you as an obstacle instead of a leader, they stop hearing your words altogether, and that's when you have to decide whether you're going to fight the noise or study the silence. And I chose the silence, because within it, the truth was starting to show itself, and I could feel that whatever they were building behind my back, it required me distracted, doubtful, and calm. And I intended to give them exactly that, while quietly preparing for the moment when whispers would no longer be enough to hide what they were really doing. The moment that finally shadowed any doubt I had came on an ordinary afternoon that was supposed to be routine. The kind of meeting I'd attended 1,000 times before, except this time I walked into a room where the air felt heavier, quieter, like everyone had already agreed on something without me. And as I took my seat, I noticed a presentation frozen on the screen behind them. My name printed there in bold letters, not under a title like founder or chairman or even advisor, but under a heading that made my stomach tighten. A heading that labeled me as a risk. And in that instant, everything slowed down. The voices in the room turned distant, and I understood before anyone spoke that this wasn't a misunderstanding or a temporary assessment. This was a plan. A carefully constructed narrative where the problems they had been creating in silence would eventually land squarely on my shoulders. And what made it cut so deep wasn't the document itself. It was the calm confidence with which Eric stood there and explained it. His voice steady, professional, almost sympathetic as he talked about the company needing to protect itself from my decline, using words like transition and safeguard and future-proofing, like he was discussing weather patterns instead of a man's life's work. And I sat there listening, not interrupting, not reacting, watching the same person I once mentored speak about me as if I were already gone, as if my contributions were history and my presence was now a threat. And in that moment the betrayal became real in a way no rumor or whisper ever could. Because this wasn't business strategy. It was character assassination dressed up in spreadsheets, and it hit harder than any physical blow ever could. Because a punch heals, a betrayal from someone you trusted settles into your bones. And I remember nodding slowly, asking a neutral question, then excusing myself like everything was normal, because the last thing I was gonna give them was a reaction they could use. And I drove home in silence, not turning on the radio, not making a call, just letting the weight of it sit with me. And when I walked into my house, empty and quiet, I didn't flip on the lights, I sat down in the dark, the same way I used to sit after long days when the kids were younger and I'd missed another dinner. Except this time there was no exhaustion, no anger, no sadness, just a strange, steady clarity. Because once you realize someone is actively trying to erase you, all the confusion disappears and you stop questioning your instincts, you stop wondering if you're overthinking things, you stop hoping for misunderstandings to clear themselves up, and you see the situation exactly as it is. And in that clarity I accepted something important, that if they wanted me gone I wasn't gonna beg to stay, I wasn't gonna plead my case, and I sure as hell wasn't gonna go quietly as the villain in their story. Because I knew what I had built, I knew the sacrifices I had made, and I knew the truth of how the company had reached this point. And sitting there in the dark, I made a decision that changed everything, not out of rage, not out of spite, but out of self-respect, that I would let them continue, let them believe their plan was working. Let them think I was unaware and unprepared, because exposing them too early would only push them to tighten their story. And I wanted the truth in the open, undeniable, supported by their own actions and words, and that meant patience, restraint, and control, qualities I had learned the hard way over decades of building something from nothing. And as I sat there listening to the quiet of my own house, I understood that this wasn't just about saving my reputation, it was about reclaiming my narrative, about making sure that when my time with the company ended, it ended on my terms with my name intact. Because once people decide you're expendable, they'll justify anything, and I wasn't about to let years of loyalty and hard work be rewritten as decline and incompetence, not by the very people who had benefited most from my trust. And that night, without raising my voice or slamming a door, I crossed an invisible line from reacting to planning, from hoping things would resolve themselves to knowing I would have to expose the truth myself. And while they thought they had labeled me and boxed me in, what they had really done was give me a clear enemy and a clear purpose. And from that point on, every step I took was deliberate, quiet, and aimed at one outcome. Walking away not as the problem they needed me to be, but as the man who refused to let betrayal define the end of his story. Once I accepted that they had already written their version of who I was becoming, I stopped trying to correct it and instead stepped fully into the role they expected me to play. Because there is a strange kind of freedom that comes when you no longer need anyone's approval. And I leaned into their narrative just enough to make them comfortable, missing a meeting on purpose here and there, arriving a little late without apology, asking questions I already knew the answers to just to watch who rushed in to explain things and who stayed quiet. And every time I did it, I could see their confidence grow, their shoulders relax, their voices sharpen, because nothing makes people bolder than believing they are smarter than you. And I let them have that illusion. I let Eric feel like he was finally running the show. Let him believe the company had already moved past me, because when people feel safe, they stop being careful. And Eric, for all his ambition, had one weakness he never learned: to control. Impatience, the kind that makes you rush decisions and cut corners because you think time is on your side. And while he hurried, I slowed down, quietly pulling records late at night, saving emails to personal drives, tracking timelines that didn't quite add up, not in a dramatic detective way, but methodically, calmly, the way you check your footing when crossing a river stone by stone. And what struck me most during that time wasn't anger. It was how predictable everything became. Once I stopped reacting, because greed follows patterns and insecurity leaves fingerprints. And the more Eric pushed forward, the sloppier he got, approving expenses too quickly, trusting the wrong people, assuming no one was watching closely anymore. And that assumption worked in my favor, because people underestimate quiet men, especially older ones. They forget that we've lived through storms they've only read about, recessions that wiped out friends, deals that collapsed overnight, betrayals that taught us how to survive without burning bridges. And those experiences teach you one thing above all else: that the loudest move is rarely the smartest one. So instead of confronting, I documented. Instead of accusing, I observed. And every night I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad, writing everything down in longhand, dates, names, decisions, conversations, not trusting memory alone, because clarity comes from seeing the whole picture laid out in front of you. And as the pages filled up, something shifted inside me. The anger I thought I'd feel never arrived, replaced instead by focus, a steady, grounded focus that made each day feel purposeful again, because I wasn't drifting anymore, I wasn't guessing, I knew exactly what I was doing and why. And I knew that by letting them believe I was done, by allowing them to underestimate me fully, I was buying myself time for them to make mistakes, time for the truth to surface on its own, time to ensure that when the moment came, it wouldn't be my word against theirs, it would be their action speaking louder than anything I could ever say. And there's a strange discipline in holding back when every instinct tells you to push forward. A discipline is something life teaches you if you survive long enough. And I had survived plenty, enough to know that patience isn't weakness, it's leverage. And as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, I could feel the balance shifting, subtle but real, because, while they thought I was fading into the background, I was building a quiet map of everything that was wrong, everything that was rushed, everything that would eventually collapse under its own weight. And the more they relaxed, the clearer that map became, until I reached a point where I wasn't reacting to their moves at all anymore. I was anticipating them. And that's when I knew the most dangerous phase of this whole situation wasn't the betrayal itself. It was the moment when the people who betrayed you believe they've already won, because that's when they stop protecting themselves. And that's when a focus man, even one they think is finished, becomes impossible to stop. Once I stopped trying to fix what was happening inside the company, I started widening my view beyond its walls, because I knew the truth I needed wouldn't come from the same rooms where the lies were being rehearsed, so quietly and without drawing attention. I began reaching out to people who had known me long before any of this mess existed. People who remembered how I worked, how I thought, and how seriously I took my name. Old clients who had trusted me with major contracts back when a handshake still meant something. Retired auditors who no longer needed to protect careers or reputations. And even a lawyer who owed me a favor from nearly 20 years back when I had helped him through a rough patch without ever asking for anything in return. And I was careful in how I approached every conversation, because I didn't accuse, I didn't complain, I didn't tell stories about betrayal or decline. I simply asked questions, the kind of calm, neutral questions that invite honesty rather than defensiveness, asking whether certain vendor practices sounded normal, whether certain fee structures raised eyebrows, whether timing like that made sense in their experience. And I listened more than I spoke, because when you let people talk without pushing them toward a conclusion, the truth tends to surface on its own. And slowly, painfully, the picture began to take shape, not as one dramatic revelation, but as a pattern that repeated itself across different voices and perspectives. Shell vendors with unfamiliar names that trace back to the same small network. Invoices that were inflated just enough to avoid immediate suspicion. Consulting fees paid for work that never clearly existed. And layers of paperwork designed to confuse anyone who didn't already know where to look. And what chilled me most wasn't the complexity of it, but how deliberate it all was, how carefully everything had been positioned to eventually point in one direction. Toward me, toward the aging founder who could be described as distracted, unfit, and out of touch. And as the pieces came together, I realized this wasn't just opportunism, it was preparation. A slow construction of a narrative where I would be the convenient explanation for missing money and questionable decisions. And the deeper I went, the clearer it became that Eric and the CFO weren't just benefiting from the chaos, they were guiding it, steering decisions in ways that looked like growth on the surface but rot underneath. And I felt a strange mix of disappointment and resolve as I saw it unfold. Disappointment because these were people I had trusted, people I had defended, and resolve because now I knew exactly what I was dealing with. And instead of rushing to expose it, I documented everything, cross-checking stories, saving confirmations, building timelines that showed intent rather than coincidence, because I understood that truth without structure is just noise. And if I wanted this to end the right way, it had to be undeniable. And all the while, inside the company, I continued playing my part, letting them believe I was fading, letting them believe I was unaware, because every day they believed that was another day they grew bolder and sloppier. And that baldness fed directly into the record I was building, brick by brick, conversation by conversation, document by document, until I reached a point where the story was no longer mine to tell. It was theirs, written in their own decisions and signatures. And that's when I knew the long game had truly begun. Because patience had given me something power never could, leverage grounded in facts. And while they were busy planning my exit, I was quietly ensuring that when the truth finally surfaced, it wouldn't just clear my name, it would explain everything. The first real crack didn't come with a speech or an accusation or some dramatic reveal. It came quietly during a board review that everyone expected to be routine. The kind where numbers are approved, projections are nodded through, and everyone leaves feeling safe. And I remember sitting there listening, letting the familiar rhythm settle in, watching Eric speak with that same confidence he'd grown into over the years, until I asked one simple question about a contract he had personally signed. Not a loaded question, not a trap, just a clean, straightforward request for clarification. And the room went still in a way that felt different, because instead of answering smoothly like he always did, Eric hesitated, just a fraction of a second too long. And in that pause I saw something flicker across his face, not confusion but calculation. And before he could finish his thought, the CFO jumped in to answer for him. Too quickly, too eagerly, filling the silence with words that didn't quite line up, and I didn't react, I didn't push, I just nodded slowly and let the moment pass. But I felt it then, the shift in the room, subtle but unmistakable, because doubt had entered, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to change the temperature. And after that meeting I adjusted my approach, not by pressing harder, but by asking more questions over time, calmly, patiently, always spaced out, always reasonable, the kind of questions that sound harmless but force people to explain their thinking out loud. And I wasn't attacking anyone, I wasn't pointing fingers. I was guiding the conversation back to fundamentals, to timelines, to responsibilities, and I watched as explanations grew longer, more tangled, as answers started contradicting earlier statements. And by the third meeting, I could sense the discomfort settling in, people shifting in their chairs, avoiding eye contact, flipping through documents a little too fast. Because once doubt takes root, it spreads quietly. And by the fifth meeting, fear had replaced confidence entirely, not fear of me, but fear of what the truth was starting to reveal. Because facts have a way of lining up when you stop brushing past them. And the more I asked, the clearer it became that certain decisions couldn't stand on their own, that certain justifications relied on assumptions no one wanted to say out loud anymore. And Eric felt it the most, because I could see the change in him outside the meetings too, the dark circles under his eyes, the restless energy, the way his hands shook just slightly when he thought no one was watching. Because confidence built on deception is fragile, and once it cracks, it doesn't recover. And I didn't need to confront him or accuse him. I just needed to stay steady, to remain present, to keep asking questions that invited the truth to step forward on its own. And as the weeks went on, the masks people had been wearing started slipping. Conversations became cautious. Alliances grew tense, and the easy arrogance that once filled the room disappeared, replaced by guarded tones and careful wording. And through it all, I stayed calm. Not because I felt powerful, but because I trusted the process I'd committed to, knowing that truth doesn't need volume to be heard. It just needs time and consistency, and watching the realization dawn on their faces, that I wasn't confused, that I wasn't fading, that I was still very much aware of what was happening. I understood something important, that fear doesn't come from being challenged, it comes from being exposed. And as the masks fell one by one, I knew there was no turning back for any of us, because once the truth starts catching up, it doesn't run, it walks steadily, and it always arrives. The final meeting didn't arrive with fireworks or raised voices or any of the drama people expect when years of tension finally break. It arrived quietly, almost respectfully, on a gray morning when the conference room felt smaller than it ever had. And I remember noticing how the chairs were lined up too neatly and how no one reached for coffee, because everyone in that room already sensed that something irreversible was about to happen. And when the folders were placed on the table, thick and organized, there was no need for introductions or speeches, because the documents spoke for themselves in a way no emotion ever could. Forensic reports laid out in clean language, timelines aligned with signatures, transactions traced back to their source without speculation or accusation. Just facts stacked carefully on top of one another until the story they told became impossible to ignore. And as the pages returned, the room filled with a silence that felt heavier than shouting. Because silence forced these people to sit with what they've done. And I watched faces change as understanding set in. Not all at once, but gradually, like a slow dawn revealing a landscape no one wanted to see. And Eric tried at first to do what had always worked for him, to talk, to explain, to reframe, to inject doubt by suggesting complexity where there was none. And then he tried to lean into the narrative they had built for months, casting glances in my direction, hinting gently that perhaps I was confused, perhaps I misunderstood, perhaps age had blurred my perspective. At this time, the words fell flat, because the truth doesn't argue, it simply exists, and once it's laid out clearly, it carries weight, the kind of weight that presses down on excuses until they collapse under it. And the lawyer stepped in not with aggression but with procedure, outlining next steps in calm, measured tones. Accounts were frozen with the click of a keyboard. Authority shifted instantly without anyone raising their voice, and in that moment I felt something unexpected. Not triumph, not satisfaction, but a deep, steady sense of finality, because what I was witnessing wasn't revenge, it was consequence. And there's a difference between the two that only becomes clear when you're standing on the other side of it. And when Eric realized there was no talking his way out, no narrative left to hide behind, I saw the exhaustion in him, the kind that comes from holding up a lie for too long. And as security escorted him and the CFO out, it happened so quietly it almost felt unreal, years of maneuvering, deception, and betrayal ending not with a scene, but with a walk down a hallway I'd walked 1,000 times myself. And I stayed seated, hands folded, not because I was stunned, but because I wanted to remember that moment exactly as it was, stripped of emotion, stripped of ego, because this wasn't about winning, it was about closure, about watching the truth land and knowing there was no lifting it once it had. And as the room slowly emptied and people avoided my eyes out of a mix of guilt and respect, I realized something important, that power doesn't always roar when it arrives. Sometimes it settles quietly into place, undeniable and complete. And when I finally stood up and walked out myself, the building felt different, not lighter, not heavier, just honest. And I knew then that whatever came next, whatever decisions I made about my future, they would be made with my name intact, my story reclaimed, and the understanding that the loudest collapses aren't always the most final ones, because sometimes everything ends not with a crash, but with a quiet walk away from the lies that could no longer stand. After the dust settled and the echoes of footsteps faded down the hallway, I didn't feel the rush of victory I'd imagined in my darker, angrier moments. I didn't celebrate, I didn't smile. I simply felt lighter. A quiet release that wasn't about proving anything to anyone. Because revenge isn't about theatrics or shouting, it's about restoring balance, and in that silence I realized how little I needed to destroy those who had betrayed me. Because their own actions, their own carefully constructed lies and manipulations had done most of the work for me. I didn't need to humiliate them publicly or rub their faces in the evidence of their failures. I didn't need to take pleasure in watching them squirm. The truth had weight, it had presence, it carried consequences all on its own. And I simply let it speak, let it unfold naturally, let the meticulous documentation and careful observation I had built over months transform the room, the company, and the people inside it without a single word from me. And when the board finally turned to me, faces tight with guilt and realization, apologizing in ways that were almost awkward because they had underestimated the gravity of their actions, offering me control again, trying to sway me with reassurance, promises, and carefully measured smiles, I declined, not out of pride, but out of principle, because control that comes from their fear or my presence at that point would have been meaningless. And instead I chose a different path, a path that required thoughtfulness, patience, and clarity. I restructured the company's leadership, putting safeguards in place that would prevent anyone from ever misusing the trust or loyalty of a founder again. I reorganized contracts, established oversight mechanisms, and made changes that no one would notice at first but that would quietly enforce accountability at every level. And all the while I stayed in the shadows, letting the system speak louder than any words could, because that is the quiet power of revenge. Not noise, not drama, not rage, a control, and control carries lessons. It teaches, it corrects, it preserves, it ensures that the work you built isn't destroyed by short-sighted greed or ambition. And when that was done, when every mechanism was in place, I walked away, fully, completely, on my own terms, not angry, not vengeful in the traditional sense, but resolute, knowing that my name remained untarnished, my reputation intact, my story preserved, exactly as it should be, because true revenge isn't about proving you're right in a fight. It's about shaping reality so that the consequences of betrayal unfold naturally, decisively, and irrevocably. And as I stepped out of the office for the last time, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, a burden I hadn't realized I'd been carrying for decades. And I understood in that quiet, reflective moment that revenge isn't about getting back at someone. It's about reclaiming your narrative, restoring your world to the order you deserve, and asserting control over the story that is yours alone, and that is far more powerful, far more enduring, and far more satisfying than any fleeting moment of anger or spectacle could ever be. Because control lasts, control defines, and control, when exercised with patience, foresight, and precision, is the ultimate form of justice, subtle yet unshakable, quiet yet undeniable. And as I looked back one last time at the empty conference room, the silent desks and the company I had built from scratch, I felt not pride, not triumph, but something better, something steadier, a calm sense of victory that didn't need applause, because the truth had been delivered, the betrayers had faced what they built, and I had emerged unscathed, intact and finally, in control. Here's the truth I only fully understood after every meeting, every betrayal, every long night of staring at spreadsheets and emails, every quiet observation and patient calculation. Getting older doesn't make you weak. It makes you dangerous if you pay attention, and I wish I had realized that decades earlier, when I was still young, hot-headed, and reactive, when every insult, every perceived slight, every underestimation would have ignited a storm of anger instead of a quiet, calculated response, because age brings more than gray hair and wrinkles, it brings perspective. It brings the understanding that strength isn't measured in how fast you strike, but in how well you wait, how carefully you plan, and how fully you let truth do its work for you. And over the years, I had watched countless younger colleagues, brimming with ambition, stumble and fall because they let ego, impatience, and pride dictate their actions. They reacted too quickly to slights, pushed too hard when diplomacy would have worked, and shouted over silence when they should have been listening. And I did some of that too in my younger days. But the mistakes that mattered most were the ones that taught me to pay attention, the betrayals that cut deepest, that taught me that silence isn't surrender, that patience isn't weakness, and that underestimation is the most powerful weapon you can ever have if you know how to use it. Because people will doubt you, let them whisper behind you back, let them plot and scheme and believe that your best days are behind you. Because those doubts and underestimations are fuel if you approach them with strategy, not emotion, and people will always underestimate what they can't see, what they can't predict. And that's where I learned to operate, quietly, invisibly, calmly, watching, recording, understanding, connecting the dots that everyone else assumed I would miss. And it wasn't just about gathering facts, it was about understanding patterns, seeing motivations, predicting the next move before anyone else even realized they were moving. And I came to understand that there's a kind of danger that older men possess that younger men rarely recognize. We have survived storms they've only read about, we've lived through crises that humbled us, we've seen deals collapse, friends betray us, reputations questioned, fortunes lost, and all of it teaches a clarity that impatience can never provide. A way to see the world that isn't clouded by ego, by haste, by the desperate need to prove oneself. And once you combine that clarity with patience, with deliberate observation, with the discipline to let people believe they're winning while you're quietly building the case that will unmask everything, the result is far more devastating than any impulsive retaliation, far more effective than any rash confrontation, because it doesn't rely on strength or noise or theatrics. It relies on inevitability, the kind of inevitability that comes from letting facts, patterns, and truth do their work over time. And as I reflected on everything that had happened with Eric, with the CFO, with the board, I realized how few truly understand this power. How many spend their lives reacting instead of observing, arguing instead of analyzing, yelling instead of recording, and I had wasted years reacting, trusting too much, assuming loyalty would last because it had always existed before. And that assumption nearly cost me everything I built. And I finally understood that the critical difference between those who survive betrayal and those who are destroyed by it isn't strength. It's attention, it's patience, it's learning to see the unseen, to read the unsaid, to anticipate consequences before they arrive. And once you have that skill, once you can move through the world quietly, letting people misjudge you, letting them underestimate you, letting them believe you are losing your mind when you are actually paying attention, more than anyone else, the opportunities that open up are astonishing. Because while they are busy plotting your downfall, you are quietly mapping their vulnerabilities, the cracks in their strategy, the mistakes that reveal themselves in human behavior when people feel untouchable. And I discovered that there is nothing more dangerous than a man they think is fading when, in truth, he has never been more awake, more aware, more methodical, and more capable of dismantling a plan built on lies. Because every misstep they make while believing you are distracted, every half-truth they utter, every corner they cut, adds another brick to the foundation of your strategy. And that realization transformed the way I live and operate in every aspect of life, not just business, because it's a lesson about perception, about the power of underestimated patience, about the art of quiet control, about the advantage of allowing ego to blind your opponents while you build clarity into every move you make. And it's why when I finally took the step back, restructured the company, installed safeguards, let justice unfold without fanfare, and walked away on my own terms, I didn't feel triumphant in the usual sense. I felt steady, grounded, and fully aware that the real victory wasn't in their punishment or humiliation. It was in the control I had exercised, in the story I had reclaimed, in the lesson I had finally internalized, which is that the older you get, the more people will doubt you, the more they will whisper, the more they will underestimate you. And if you can resist the urge to react, to prove yourself, to lash out, and instead pay attention, document, analyze, anticipate, and move with quiet purpose, you wield a kind of power they will never see coming. And I finally understood that lesson, painfully, slowly, but completely, and it changed everything because I learned that what most people call weakness, what they call fading, what they call losing one's mind with age, is actually a hidden advantage, a kind of invisible armor that shields you while you prepare, a clarity that hones your judgment, and a patience that allows truth to do its work for you. And from that day forward, nothing in life or business looked the same, because I had finally realized that the mind they thought was slipping was, in fact, the sharpest weapon I had ever held. And once you see it, once you understand it, the entire world shifts, the game changes, and you finally step into a level of awareness and control that very few ever attain. And that realization, that one lesson, that understanding of how to move quietly, deliberately, and decisively while everyone else misreads your intentions, that lesson alone was worth every sleepless night, every betrayal, every shadow of doubt, because it taught me how to wield patience as a weapon, silence as a shield, and underestimated perception as the ultimate form of power. And as I look back now, I can say with certainty that no wealth, no recognition, no title could ever have given me what I gained from that understanding, because learning how to move unseen, how to let people believe they've won while you quietly prepare, how to turn doubt into opportunity, and how to finally, fully control your own story, is not something that can be taught. It is earned through experience, observation, and the kind of patience that only comes with age. And that lesson, bitter, slow, and profound, is what changed everything for me, because it revealed that the world is never just about action. It's about perception, it's about timing, it's about knowing when to step forward and when to remain silent. And it is only when you combine these things with relentless attention that you transform from someone underestimated into someone unstoppable. And that is the truth I learned too late, but just in time to reclaim everything I had built, everything I had earned, and everything I had ever valued. And once you see it, once you understand it, you can never go back to living by the old rules, because the mind they thought was fading was always yours, sharp, patient, and fully awake. And now, finally, you know how to use it.